I mean, like at the end of the day, I have to say, being here in Russia, that no matter who wins, it's not going to make any difference anyway. I mean, Trump has just spent the last 4 years destroying all the arms treaties that underpinned, detente and security in the world. Biden has no incentive to do anything. He will bring back the Obama team. That means there will be no progress in the Russian-America relationship for the next 4 years because the Democrats hate Russia so much because of all the propaganda and the narrative. Obviously, that would be a disaster for Russia too. It would probably mean more sanctions.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, and as always, joined by my co-host, Max Blumenthal. This is part 2 of our interview with the Irish journalist Bryan MacDonald, who has lived in Russia for many years. He is an editor at the Russia desk for RT and really knows the country inside and out. And we were in the first part, we were talking about the media narrative around the alleged poisoning of the opposition figure Alexei Navalny, his real politics, the fact that he is rather a fringe figure inside Russia, and the strange circumstances around this alleged poisoning, how it was used to clearly try to sabotage the Russian pipeline with Germany, known as the Nord Stream 2. So definitely check out the first part. We also talked about the color revolution attempt in Belarus and the insides and outsides of that. In this second part, we're going to continue our discussion on Russia, but we're going to begin talking about the late American scholar Stephen Cohen. He just passed away this September. Stephen Cohen was a brilliant scholar who documented the Soviet Union and then the collapse, the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the transition to a neoliberal capitalist government. And unlike basically all of his critics, he actually spent a lot of time in the country and spoke Russian. And then after that, we're going to talk about this conspiracy theory that's become popular among liberal circles, that was really popularized by think tanks, by kind of NATO apparatchiks, by pro-EU so-called leftists. And that is the idea that there's this big red-brown alliance between fascists and socialists and communists to try to destroy Western liberal democracy, and how Russia plays a key role in the figment of that liberal imagination, of that conspiracy theory. And then finally, at the end of this part, we're going to talk about the Biden camp and what will happen if Biden somehow manages to win the election. We're going to talk about some of the very hawkish anti-Russia figures around Biden who will be overseeing a potential Biden administration's foreign policy, people like Michael Carpenter. So definitely continue and check out part 2. This is Moderate Rebels, and without further ado, here we go.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
Rebels.
This is a good moment to talk about someone who also academically, in a scholarly way, documented that transition. Stephen Cohen. I mean, I'd love to hear what both of you guys think, but Stephen Cohen was a brilliant scholar, and what's interesting about him is Stephen Cohen was definitely among the academic experts, foreign academic experts of the Soviet Union and Russia. He was definitely not pro-Soviet. He definitely wasn't one of the diehard anti-communist right-wing historians that dominate American and Western European historiography, who have become the kind of like go-to historians of the Soviet Union, who have many dubious figures about deaths and a lot of shoddy historical work. But Stephen Cohen was an interesting guy because he definitely was not pro-Soviet, but he was very fair. He was actually balanced in his appraisal. And what's incredible to see is how this is someone who is welcomed by kind of mainstream liberal bourgeois opinion makers in the US until the Yeltsin years, in which he actually spoke out against the brutal neoliberal shock therapy that was going on. And then especially in recent years, he was just totally smeared by some of the same people at the New York Times and elsewhere who had previously endorsed and supported him, they all smeared him as a Putin apologist. I mean, it's an example just of that political shift that Max was talking about toward just an insane, unhinged anti-Russia position at every level.
Oh yeah, I remember the demonization of Stephen Cohen, gentleman, great scholar, tough cookie as well, by the way. Not someone who would be afraid to, fight his corner. The demonization of Stephen started around 2014, 2015, around the time of the Ukraine crisis, when he tried to explain, the real situation, like he was opposed to the West's interference in Ukraine. He tried to explain that Ukraine was considered an existential thing for, Russia, and that American presence there was something similar to, that Putin's reaction, Russia's reaction, was somewhat analogous to the way Kennedy reacted when the Soviets tried to move into Cuba in the 60s, when we almost had a nuclear war. And he was very rational about it. But, this thing started to demonize him, was led by people like Michael Weiss and, others who, in the think tank racket and in outlets like the Daily Beast and various other reactionary things. And, Stephen would have said he didn't let it bother him or get to him. But, Katrina, his wife, wrote today in an obituary piece for The Nation that it did get to him and it did upset him. And I think to Stephen, the problem is that Stephen was a policy guy, a guy who dealt in facts, not in ideology. He dealt in how things are rather than how, people want them to be. And what he couldn't understand was why people were, going into personal defamation to such a degree. And this is something that started maybe gotten worse with the internet and Twitter and online media and everything. But definitely there's been the discourse has become incredibly uncouth. I mean, I know that your father, Max, was involved in politics years ago, and that it might give you an indication. But as far as I can see, things are far more grubby than they used to be. I think once upon a time you could disagree with somebody in America on the basis of their policy or their platform, but you didn't, denigrate them personally. But it seems to become incredibly uncouth, as I said now. And if you disagree with someone now, you have to defame them as well. And I think an older gentleman like Stephen, that came from a different time, a man who died in his 80s just now, I think he found that unfathomable and difficult to understand. Like, why are these people attacking my character to such a degree? He couldn't understand that.
I think there always was, obviously, there was nastiness in Washington. One story I could relate is Bob Kerrey, who is a Vietnam veteran and senator from Nebraska, who ran for president. I think my father was writing the letter from Washington for the New Yorker, wrote a fairly negative profile of him. And Bob Kerrey said, I think publicly, I'd like to wipe that preppy smile off his face, like he wanted to knock him out. And so my father, and they had been previously friendly, I think. He mailed him a Xerox copy of his diploma from Sullivan High School in Chicago, which is a public high school in Chicago, in the heart of Chicago, and a note, and it said, how about a drink, not a duel? And that was kind of the way people jousted with each other in the intelligentsia and politics in Washington. But now with the sort of the proliferation of social media combined with the just unhinged hostility of new Cold War fever, where the U.S. is really, the especially the kind of liberal intelligentsia has lost its sense of security, and that security was derived from the hegemonic unipolar moment of the 90s, when they felt like they were on top of the world and they were leading it. Bill Clinton was president. Now you have Russia hacking the election. Hillary Clinton loses. Her moment is denied. Stephen Cohen is the one kind of pillar of the academy left standing who has this record of real scholarship on Russia, living in Moscow, being producing the seminal work on Bukharin, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, a book on how the Soviet Union could have been reformed but was pushed into shock therapy. His book on the Vietnam level crime of the raiding of Russia's economy in the 1990s and the 3 to 5 million excess deaths that ensued. It all amounted to this. It all came together in this new Cold War at the nation, and I saw it play out on social media in a hideous fashion with younger, less qualified editors and just fanatical liberals like Katha Pollitt just attacking him mercilessly and using him as a proxy to try to destroy Katrina vanden Heuvel, who essentially paid their salaries as the publisher of the nation. And none of them received any consequences for this. So I can relate to you one story where Roan Carey, he doesn't have much. He's on Facebook, but he's not on Twitter. So, I mean, Ben might not know him, but I dealt with him at the
I
Nation.
know him. Yeah, I mean, he's definitely one of these liberal interventionist types who thinks regime change wars are progressive revolutions.
Yeah, so Stephen went on Tucker Carlson because that was one of the few places where you can get a forum before a national audience to actually put Russian policy or national interest in context and try to explain to Americans why, Putin's doing this or that based on his scholarship. And Roan starts a thread on Facebook demonizing Stephen Cohen as, not only a Putin apologist, but a secret right winger, sort of a crypto fascist. And then Adam Schatz from the London Adam Schatz from London Review of Books chimes in and says, this is disgusting. And they're talking about it like it's this internal plague at the nation that they have to root out. Katha Pollitt, meanwhile, is, attacking not just Stephen, but this kind of what she calls the Putin apologist clique, which includes, they would call James Corden part of it. And they were basically, this pitched battle began at the Nation. I mean, it would have made a great article for someone to write about at the time. And it all, it never got resolved except that these really crude liberal characters who demonized Stephen, who would never debate him directly, wound up, remaining entrenched in their positions and never faced any consequences. I found that just so bizarre. The last time I saw Stephen was at this remarkable event in Washington last winter where he stood before a packed room at the Metropolitan Club, which is kind of like a, it's a club downtown where it's near the White House. You have to wear a tie and jacket to get in. And it was hosted by a group called Empire Salon, which is a group of mostly retired foreign policy professionals who really represent a kind of a convergence between the non-interventionist conservative wing and the anti-interventionist left. But a lot of just mainstream people participate in these forums as well. And after his talk, Stephen held Q&A with the audience and faced many hostile questioners from the mainstream foreign policy world in the US. And he faced them down with really characteristic erudition, patience, and he, with his scholarly reputation, was given the ability to explain himself in that environment. And afterwards we went out and we talked about what had been happening at the Nation. And I can tell you, it did affect him to have earned the reputation he deserved with his scholarship and his ability to insinuate himself into Russian society and know Russians who lived through the Stalin era and to convey their experience, and then to be treated with just so much viciousness and hostility in social media forums where he didn't even participate. So, I mean, we went at Roan. I went off on Roan because, Stephen wasn't there to defend himself and Katrina didn't want to engage in these ugly battles. And that really, I was done at the Nation after doing that because Roan was my editor there. I was just disgusted by the whole thing. But that was the last time I saw Stephen. I had a great time with him and Katrina, and now he's just gone. And he was really, still on his game. It's really sad. He was 81.
The big danger for you guys in America right now is there's nobody to replace him. There's no obvious.
There's just us hacks,
Yeah, but the point is that Stephen occasionally could go on a show like Anderson Cooper, where about 2 or 3 years ago he wiped the floor with Max Boot. He could go on a CNN show because he'd been such a big name in the 80s and 90s. He still sometimes was able to break through the block and get on to CNN, to get on to Fox, or these, and get a platform. There's nobody like that now. And all you're going to have is the McFalls and the Carpenters, but nobody with any kind of, gravitas to stand up to them.
Well, and especially someone like Stephen Cohen, who had experience in the former Soviet Union and who spoke Russian and who was a major scholar. I mean, someone of that caliber.
Friend of Gorbachev, advisor to Bush. I mean, very much a mainstream character.
Yeah, I mean, he tried to start, this East-West initiative to forge better ties between the U.S. establishment and Russia, and that was essentially destroyed. And so you're right, we're left with this, in media, we're left with a scenario where there is no scholarly voice of opposition to this potentially extinction-level policy of Cold War hostility. And Aaron Mate pointed out on Twitter yesterday, our colleague, that Democracy Now! Observed Stephen Cohen's death and said, he was a great Russian scholar, he died. And Aaron pointed out that he hadn't been welcomed on Democracy Now! Since he mopped the floor with Ken Roth, the President for Life, permanent dear leader of Human Rights Watch, over the Syrian proxy war. And that was like in 2016. So throughout this whole period of Russiagate, which Stephen Cohen was calling out, and he called out the Steele dossier 24 hours after it was first publicized for what it was, which was just a gigantic sham. He was not welcomed on even the progressive shows like Democracy Now! And so the hypocrisy of Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! To observe his death and say that he was a frequent guest when they, in fact, during the Russiagate era, hosted Kurt Eichenwald more times than they hosted him, was astounding.
Kurt Eichenwald, geez, that brings back a memory.
Yeah, and I also think that it's really telling, Max, because you mentioned Ron Carey. This is an editor at The Nation, and I know people might think this is kind of inside baseball, but I think these names are kind of important because they're also stand-ins for they represent particular political tendencies. Ron Carey, who, as you mentioned, was pushing this anti-Russia line, he also was pushing at the same time a line strongly supporting the regime change war in Syria, attacking anyone who criticized the conventional mainstream narrative that this is a great progressive revolution, that the CIA, their involvement was minimal at best, that if you criticize the Salafi jihadists who dominate the opposition, you're Islamophobic. And what's interesting is that Stephen Cohen was kind of caught in this new narrative that it took me a few years to understand how it was being weaponized, but this whole red-brown narrative, how it was being used by some of these same forces that are linked to U.S. intelligence agencies or sympathetic to U.S. intelligence agencies, who realized that they could win over the kind of progressive-minded voices at The Nation by crafting this narrative by saying, if you are sympathetic in any way to the idea that we should have good relations with Russia and we should not have a new Cold War, that you are facilitating fascism because supposedly, according to this narrative, supposedly Putin is a crypto-fascist, if not an outright fascist. Russia is an authoritarian far-right regime, supposedly, according to the narrative. And anyone who supports, like Stephen Cohen, supports having better relations with this country is facilitating fascism. So that was the way that that was the way of kind of squaring the circle of U.S. intelligence agencies, these kind of disinformation warriors at think tanks. They formed a kind of coalition, de facto coalition, between the kind of neoconservative forces behind, the Iraq War, who all are now, many of them are on board with the Democratic Party, and some supposedly enlightened progressives who are the kind of people who write at The Nation. And what that did is push out people like Stephen Cohen, who was not even a leftist. He was a liberal, but he was an actual Russia scholar. So they were portraying this man who had dedicated his life to studying Russia as a crypto-fascist. It's absolutely incredible.
The interesting about this Putin kind of crypto-fascist thing is that, and I hate to bring it back, to like anything to do with Judaism, but like, it's very interesting. Like, I would argue that there has never been a leader in Russia that's as receptive to the Jewish community as to Vladimir Putin. Look at his now, Israel itself, I know there's issues with its governance, but the idea that Putin is some kind of crypto-fascist, leader is ridiculous. I mean, for example, the Friends of Zion back in January presented him with an award, about, friendship of Zion for, the Russians saving the Jews during World War II. And I want to get off the Jewish topic because it's not just Jews. I mean, if you look at Putin, for example.
Well, I mean, Israel has a far-right government, so it's actually not.
Yeah, I
mean,
agree.
he's definitely
that's
not
why
anti-Semitic.
that's why I want to move off it.
Yeah.
That's why I want to move off it. That's why I want to move off
Yeah.
it. But I'm trying to make the point that it's not just about Jewish people. It's also about Muslim people, for example. Putin has extremely good relations with all Muslim states around Russia where it is applicable. Okay, there is no, even though Putin is a committed Orthodox Christian, there is nothing in his policy to suggest that he is, against people from any other religious or ethnic background. If you look at the Russian government, for example, the defense minister is from half Buryatian, which is a Mongol ethnic group in the Sergei Shoigu. So he's genetically, ethnically, from the east of Asia. There are Muslim people in the Russian government and have been. There have been Jewish people in the Russian government. There's nothing to say. One thing Putin is not is a crypto-fascist. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing to say. You can say what you like about Putin. You can call him this and that, but this kind of American thing to compare him to Hitler or something like this. I mean, like I remember when in Crimea happened in 2014, and this was something Stephen was very strong on. Remember all this coverage saying that next thing Putin was going to invade the Baltics, next thing Putin was going to invade Poland and all this kind of stuff. And even Prince Charles, of all people, the future British king, said, I think he's another Hitler. I mean, like, Putin has been in office since the year 2000. If anything, he's coming to the end of his presidency. I expect, like a lot of people do, that he will step down in 2024 around then. If he was going to be another Hitler, he'd want to hurry on, wouldn't he? I mean, after 20 years, he'd really want to hurry on. Plus the fact that he's been reducing the defense budget for the last number of years. I mean, it's a very strange policy for someone that plans on starting a war, cutting his defense spending, But I mean, that's the point.
Yeah. It took me a while to understand, just on this, before we move away from this red-brown thing, it took me a while, because several years ago when I was dumber and more sympathetic to this kind of like these anarchist talking points and the war in Syria and all this stuff, and I was confused by all the propaganda. This was well before Trump, and it took me a while to understand the kind of arc of this propaganda, because you can just see the hand in retrospect of these intelligence agencies, of think tanks try to shape certain narratives. And the whole red-brown thing came from these same people who were also the ones who were strongly against Brexit. And they said, if you supported Brexit, you're also crypto-fascist. And then the ones, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, if you're against NATO and the European Union, which are deeply neoliberal institutions, that you are somehow a crypto-fascist. And it really took hold of the US left when it came to Russia. And then when Trump came to power, that was like the apotheosis. That was the moment when it really broke through and became mainstream. Before that, it was mostly like anarchists and Trotskyites who were the ones pushing this red-brown thing. And then with Brexit in the UK, that was the moment when it became mainstream in the UK, and a lot of elements of like the leftist kind of media bubble, like publications, like the New Statesman, and you even have like Novara Media, they were all pushing this narrative that Brexit was crypto far right. And it took me a while to see how, and then Russia plays a key role in that. Of course, in Germany, you had the Die Linke party, which you have elements of it that want to have better relations with Russia. So then there was this narrative led by anti-Deutsch, the German anarchists who are pro-Western imperialism and pro-Israel and pro-NATO. They started pushing this narrative that Die Linke is a crypto-fascist red-brown party. And now with Trump in power, it's just become mainstream among the liberals. But it was incredible how effective that narrative was.
Yeah, the term tankies was unknown before the Trump era. It's somehow like now used by mainstream think tankers who wear lanyards and walk around K Street.
I thought tankies was something to describe people that wore tank tops or something. I don't know what it was about.
I swear I had not heard it before 2017. At the same time, you don't see that just the term trots emerging in the mainstream, maybe because of its...
I had heard tankies a lot in the left because, I come from the left, and when I was in high school and college, I was involved. And it was always very few people ever used that term. And seeing it over the past, and like the whole red-brown thing, these were terms that like, they were like on the margins used by anarchists who wrote books for AK Press. But then there was this clear intelligence campaign, and you can see the hand with the Integrity Initiative. People like Alexander Reed Ross, who are these obscure anarchist figures that no one knew about, but who like were welcomed in these think tank circles because intelligence operatives clearly saw that there was a utility and these narratives, and now they're totally mainstream. And like you see people at the New York Times use the term tanky. They have no idea that it references 1956 in Hungary. They have no idea because it's just become totally emptied of its original meaning and is now. It's incredible how that works.
It's it comes from Hungarian Revolution.
So it was the split. Well, counter-revolution. It was the split where, with the British Communist Party, there were people in the British Communist Party who, ironically, people use tanky and Stalinist as if they're synonymous, but ironically, it was actually Khrushchev who ordered sending in the tanks to Hungary. Khrushchev, who himself was, of course, vehemently anti-Stalin, who had a de-Stalinification program, but ironically, supposedly the tanky as a smear term was used by the people in the British Communist Party when there was a split who opposed sending the military intervention in to end the right-wing protests in Hungary to try to overthrow the Hungarian government, many of which, by the way, were Horthyites who were linked to the kind of Nazi, not all of them, I'm not going to say that they all were, but there were definitely strong elements like in Ukraine
the former Nazi apologists. Did Aaron tell you all this?
No.
Did they tell you all this?
No, I've read a lot. Well, I've read a lot about this, but actually, I mean, this is a good example because Aaron's family comes from there were Jews from Hungary, and in the 1956 counter protest, there's a strong far right anti-Jewish sentiment because it's true that, I mean, it's an anti-Semitic stereotype, but it's true that there were a disproportionate number of Jews in the Hungarian communist leadership because they had been discriminated against by the previous right-wing monarchy of Horthy that was pro-Nazi. So anyway, the point is that almost no one using that term today, tanky, knows any of that history. It's incredible.
I had no idea about it. All I know is that, for me, what makes me a little bit different than you guys is that politically I would be broadly centrist, if I'm honest. I wouldn't be as much to the left as you guys would be. What concerns me is that when I see people throwing around these, things like fascist and Nazi and blah, blah, it's deeply, deeply unhealthy. I mean, like, it's really unhealthy to have terms, because the problem is that when the real fascists arrive or the real Nazis arrive, the term has been abused so much that it no longer has the same connotations it should have.
And that's true in Russia too, because as you know, there are actual neo-Nazis in Russia. There are actual fascists, and some of the fascists are actually, they oppose Putin. You mentioned some of the opposition figures who are far to the right of Putin.
Well, Zhirinovsky was held off by Putin. Zhirinovsky, if anyone is closer to fascism or ultranationalism, it's him. And Putin held him back.
Navalny's an interesting one because Navalny's origins, now more, but if he is, he's hiding it very well. But Navalny's roots are in the Russian far right. I mean, Navalny used to take part in what used to be the annual Russian March, which was a far right Nazi parade that used to take place every year, and that was his roots. I mean, and that's all been brushed under the carpet now, and he claims that he's no longer that way inclined. But like, that's the reality. Yes, that there are real fascists in Russia, and when people go around calling Vladimir Putin a fascist, for example, they have no idea of what a real Russian fascist looks like.
Well, what about the ironically named Liberal Democratic Party?
Nuts. I mean, but a lot of that though is a form of performance art, to be honest with you. He sort of plays a role in the system. He's a bit of a clown. He's kind of a systemic clown. I wouldn't take it too seriously. I'd be more concerned about, for example, the Rodina Party, which is motherland, homeland in Russian. They just won a city council in Tambov last week in this country that has no democracy, according to The Economist. Anyway, they won a city council in Tambov last week, because, well, don't tell The Economist about that. But the problem is that scares me, because that's an entire Russian city that has voted for the far right. And because they're an anti-Semitic party, deeply anti-Semitic, by the way. And what scares me even more is the fact that the Western media, they spent the last 2 weeks writing about Navalny made gains in the election. Navalny's people won 7 local council seats. That's what they won, and fair play to them. And it's great that they won those seats. No, I'm actually being serious. I'm not laughing. I'll tell you why it's great, because I think it's great to see more political plurality in Russia on a personal level. So it's a good thing. But the point is that Navalny's people, they won 7 council seats in 2 cities, Novosibirsk and Tomsk, right? And the Western media ran headlines saying gains for Navalny in Russian elections. I mean, you're talking about 7 city council seats. The far right Rodna actually won control of a whole city, and not an insignificant city. You know, Tambov is quite big, and there's not a word about it. And that's what's, you know, scary. And when I was saying at the outset that this misrepresentation of Navalny in the American and British media, it's dangerous in the extent that it obscures what's really going on inside Russia. So policymakers in Washington go, oh, look, it's on the New York Times. Navalny made gains in the local election. They don't understand that these are insignificant city council seats. And these guys have no clue, unless they're watching this program, that the far right took control of a whole city. You know what I mean? That scares me.
This is the environment that Stephen Cohen spent the last 4 years of his life in, and it was just agonizing to watch. So, I guess in closing, since we mentioned Michael Carpenter, there's now a manufactured freakout in Washington where a secret CIA assessment has declared that Putin may be responsible for the Russian campaign against Biden, which consists of, if you read the fine print, Russian media saying mean things about Joe Biden, who, was the man who basically was the sort of imperial governor of Ukraine for the first several months after Maidan. He was just personally presiding over the looting of its state assets and the imposition of a new nationalist government. So naturally, Russia won't like Joe Biden, but let's say Joe Biden wins. I mean, what are your views on his foreign policy, and what are people saying in Russia about a potential Biden administration?
The problem with Biden from a Russian point of view is very, very simple. I'll explain it to you as succinctly as I can. First of all, his age, and that's not his fault, of course, that makes it very unlikely that he would make any effort to go for detente with Moscow, because, look, he's not exactly an energetic young man who's going to come into this like a Kennedy or even an Obama with new ideas or fresh ideas. He wants to change the world or something. That's gone. Any ideology that, long gone. What will happen is that, as you know, Biden will be some kind of holding president. And what he will probably do is he will bring back the Obama team, because that's what he knows. He'll bring back all the same guys, McFaul and Carpenter and Victoria Nuland probably, and what's her name, the awful woman from Ireland, Samantha Power. He'll bring back all those. Definitely, whatever. Anyway, I can't believe I was born in the same city as her. Anyway, the point is that
I was born in the same city, or I was raised in the same city as Susan Rice. So,
okay,
we're future Secretary of State.
We're level on that. Anyway, the point is that he will bring back the Obama team. That means there will be no progress in the Russian-America relationship for the next 4 years, because the Democrats hate Russia so much because of all the propaganda and the narrative. Obviously, that would be a disaster for Russia too. It would probably mean more sanctions. So that's the first element of it. The second element of it is that Joe Biden has got extremely bad advice on Russia. I mean, at the end of the day, Mike Carpenter is his Russia guy. I mean, come on, at least Trump, for all of his faults, he had Fiona Hill. No matter what you say about Fiona Hill, and I found her quite opportunist. I think she's done a lot to boost her personal profile. She is a genuine expert on Russia, to be fair to her, to Fiona Hill. She knows her stuff. There's no doubt about that. Maybe not as big an expert as people think in America, because she hasn't got very much on the ground experience, at least recently. But she definitely knows her stuff to a degree. Michael Carpenter knows nothing. Michael McFaul knows a lot, but pretends not to, because it's more politically advantageous to him to play a role in the system. That's the danger from Moscow's point of view. And the third thing is that, for reasons I can't quite fathom, Joe Biden has some deep, personal, genuine affection for Ukraine. It's not so simple as in being, this kind of imperial overlord. Joe Biden really likes Ukraine for some reason. I don't know why, and particularly likes this Western Ukrainian nationalist thing, you know, and that's a problem for Russia too, because Biden obviously is going to absolutely take a pro-Kiev agenda as president, and he will not be interested. And the thing as well is that he will not even be interested in hearing what Moscow has to say, because as far as Biden is concerned, he'll be a one-term president no matter what. He won't have to face re-election. I mean, come on, he's not going to go for re-election at 82, is he? Come on. So he's going to be, if he even manages to stay in office for 4 years, he's going to be a one-shot president. There's no incentive for him to make a deal with Moscow. His party hates Russia as it is, so you can forget about it. So that's what Russia thinks about Biden. Now, about the story today, I think it was written by I forget his name. Sorry. Anyway, but anyway, Josh Rogan, was it in the Washington Post? Look, this is typical. This is
a close friend of intelligence agencies, neocon.
Well, what he did today is obviously not journalism. It was a story that was handed to him. You know, as Boris Johnson would say, it was given to him oven ready. You know, just pop it in the oven, off we go. That's his.
Well, he's the Pillsbury Doughboy of neoconservatism. I mean,
interesting expression.
He's the hot pocket of punditry.
Well, there you go. I don't know much about Mr. Rogan, to be honest with you, so I'll defer to your superior knowledge. But I would just say that
American snack food. But anyway, go on.
No, I don't know. I don't either. Anyway, but look, I will just say that I don't know about Rogan or American snack food. But I'll just say that. Look, the story is based on anonymous sources, as Ben quite correctly said. You know, it's buried down the bottom. It's some things on TV. You will have noted today, by the way, if you don't mind me saying this, we're recording this on September 22nd. There is a video released by RT today. You've probably seen it mocking Donald Trump using deep fake technology. Have you seen it yet? No. But it's interesting that when Russian media has a go at Trump, that's not considered to be interference. It's only when it has a go at the Democrats that it's considered to be interference.
RT did these campaign ads that were just masterful for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016. And the Hillary one was just mocking her evil laugh, and it was like hilarious Clinton or Hilarian Clinton. And then the Donald Trump one had Abraham Lincoln listening to Donald Trump from inside the Lincoln Memorial, and then he started to cry tears of blood. And then it's on screen. It said, "Make America Hate Again."
Yeah, I mean, like at the end of the day, I have to say, being here in Russia, that no matter who wins, it's not going to make any difference anyway. I mean, Trump has just spent the last 4 years destroying all the arms treaties that underpinned, detente and security in the world. Biden has no incentive to do anything. And the other thing I would just say as well, as a non-American and foreign observer who has studied Russia intensely, that there are deep similarities between American politics at the moment and what was going on in the Soviet Union in the early 80s. America has become a gerontocracy. It's become a gerontocracy. I mean, when I was growing up, America was, when I was growing up, you had people like Bill Clinton. You still had the Kennedy legacy. You had like Al Gore, George Bush Jr. for all of his faults. I mean, but these were relatively youthful men when they took office. I mean, they were in their 50s, 40s, whatever have you. America, you always associated with kind of people with vitality. Leaders with a bit of passion and stuff. No, but really, you did. Now, honestly, I mean, as an outsider,
well, it's just funny thinking about that now. I mean,
no, but you did. I mean,
it's a country that's a zombie country falling apart. But I know what you mean historically.
Well,
it becomes. So what I'm saying is that it's become a gerontocracy. So yeah, but a Russian. Kamala, fair enough. But somebody said to me the other day that a Russian asked me on Sunday night, actually in a bar, asked me, could I explain what is going on with the American election? And I said, to be honest with you, I said, Danil is his name. I said, Danila, I said, to be honest with you, I said, it's basically like Chernenko running against Andropov. Essentially, that's what it is. I mean, that's the only way I could describe it to the Russian. It's two very old men in charge of a decaying system. And it's really like Konstantin Chernenko running against, Viktor Andropov in the 80s in Russia. And we know what happened in Russia, that what the gerontocracy led to. And it seems in America, for some reason, you guys have been unable to replenish your system. And that's quite scary.
Well, those who came into the race with new ideas were someone who fit well into the gerontocracy, who had been around for a long time, but who represented the youth of the U.S., Bernie Sanders. And the other one, Tulsi Gabbard, who really challenged the new Cold War consensus, was subjected to this tidal wave of disinformation and effectively destroyed and then systematically drowned out, excluded from debates and so on. But,
Biden
would it not have been better for Bernie? Would it not have been better for Bernie after what happened in 2016 to have groomed the younger person from his wing of the party to run this time? Wouldn't that have been better?
Exactly. That's a great point. There is no successor to Bernie Sanders, although the person being kind of put up as his successor, who's now sheepdogging her young followers into the Democratic
But that's
Party.
Bernie's fault. Bernie's fault. He had time to groom a successor, but he chose not to.
Right. That's a great point. I do not see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a successor to Bernie Sanders' legacy, and she's the one she's being positioned to be that, but she doesn't have a similar background. I don't know if anyone does, but Bernie Sanders has been in the struggle to some degree.
As I understand as well, AOC has a completely orthodox foreign policy position.
Yeah, when she talks about it.
A lot of people forget that she signed an anti-China bill or resolution with Ted Cruz.
Yeah, and what's even more disgusting to me is she campaigned talking about Puerto Rico, but never addresses Puerto Rico and the brutal colonial oppression of that country. I mean, I mentioned she has orthodox foreign policy when she even talks about it, which she almost never does.
And she's of Puerto Rican heritage, is that right? Is she of Puerto Rican heritage?
Yeah, but she grew up.
Yes,
she grew up in inside the continental U.S. But during her campaign, she really played up her background, and now she never talks about Puerto Rico. She never talked. I mean, she did for like a few weeks when there was mainstream coverage of the protests. But there's a major referendum coming up on the election in Puerto Rico for independence. She never talks about it. It's insane.
That'd be like Joe Biden not talking about Ireland, basically, which he seems to do every day.
But I mean, Puerto Rico is colonized by the U.S. I mean, Ireland was colonized by the U.K., so it would be like if an Irish politician in the U.K. playing that up, their Irish identity up, but then when they come into power, they never talk about the Irish liberation struggle.
You know what breaks my heart here as an Irish person is that basically Biden's entire government is going to be Irish people, but really dumb Irish people. It's going to be like Carpenter, Carpenter. I think McFaul will come back in some way. I mean, you've got, Samantha Power will come back in. They're all Irish and they're all useless.
Well, the Jewish people in a Biden administration who will manage his Middle East policy will certainly be the finest minds available. Martin Indyk, Dennis Ross, who else? Daniel Shapiro. I mean, these people have presided over one series of deliberate failure after another that has led to the steal of the century under Donald Trump. And they're cheering on the UAE deal with Israel. I mean, it's just absurd. At every level of the foreign policy apparatus, there's just a level of delusion. And we haven't even talked about China yet. I mean, I got to go, but I would just conclude by saying that I think a Biden administration would bring in a very similar policy towards China as Trump's, slightly more accommodation, is not as aggressive and vulgar. But, Ben mentioned this conspiracy theory of a red-brown alliance. And what we're actually seeing take form is a blue-brown alliance around China, which was perfectly encapsulated in an interview that Matt Iglesias, who has just been this mainstay liberal blogger who just, I don't know why people listen to him. I just find him, I'd rather watch paint dry than listen to him talk. But he has a new book about, the demographic peril of
1 billion Americans.
Yeah, the demographic peril of China. And he gave an interview to Glenn. He's there with Glenn Beck, and they're both in perfect accord on the need to outbreed the Chinese and to either import or, procreate to have 1 billion Americans just because of this fear of Chinese hegemony. And I thought, there you go. That's the future blue-brown alliance over China, which was also embodied in the resolution that AOC and Ted Cruz both sponsored.
Yeah, and on this note, really quickly, Michael McCaul, not McFaul, but Michael McCaul, who has been the Republican chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, he just posted this insanely unhinged video announcing that he is now the chair of the China Task Force, and he said Communist China is the greatest security threat to America. And I mean, they're going in hyperdrive right now, and the Biden camp is totally on board.
Say something though, by the way. Saying that China is the biggest security threat to America is not particularly unhinged. I mean, there is a certain degree of truth in that. Come on. I mean, China is a peer competitor. There's no doubt about it.
It is a
security threat, a supposed threat to U.S. economic hegemony. Yeah, but security threat? What are the Chinese going to like bomb the U.S.? I mean, that's insane.
No, but you could say that, if America goes into economic decline, that's a threat to its security, for example, or if America's position as the hegemon economically. So there is some, I'm not saying that, I'm not agreeing with him. I'm just saying that there's some element of truth to that. But the discourse around Russia is far more unhinged. Like when people say that Russia is the biggest threat to the US, Russia fundamentally, at the end of the day, is only the fifth biggest economy in the world by purchasing power parity. It's 9th or 10th by nominal GDP. While it remains a strong military power, its military budget is something like 12 times lower than that of the US. So even with purchasing power parity, it's 4 times, less or 5 times less. So the point is that that's what, by being here, that's what kind of, this idea, like, so if the Republicans are saying that China is a threat, that's some way believable. But the Democrat thing that Russia is a threat is just ridiculous. I'm sorry. It just is. Russia is like, in terms of power and influence, Russia is more like Germany, for example. It's kind of a leading European power. It's not a potential superpower like China.
What's dangerous about that narrative, though, is that that's exactly what some of these Republicans are trying to do. And I'm not saying you're doing that. You're clearly not. But what I'm saying is that on Fox News, you'll hear some of these people say, well, Russia's not the threat. The real threat is China. So there's this attempt, and this was Steve Bannon's whole thing, and a certain wing of the right wing.
If you think that not being the biggest economy in the world is a threat, well then yes. But a rational country would not think like that. A rational country would just accept the fact that things change over time. And don't forget that who made China rich? It was American neoliberals who wanted to outsource everything, so, to make bigger profits.
Yeah, well, we thought that would bring democratic freedom and that China would open up. That's the narrative that they say. And then Xi came in and he's this brutal dictator. So, I think, we're moving into first of all, hopefully we're moving to the close of this podcast. But I think, we're moving towards not necessarily a multipolar world, but maybe a bipolar world where this hysteria has pushed Russia and China closer to one another. Something that, any historian of the Sino-Soviet split would find kind of remarkable. And Russians, it's my understanding, I mean, obviously I know like 1/1,000,000th less than you about it, but it seems like Russians are embracing this and are no longer really looking west.
Russians are only doing this, Max, because at the end of the day, China is the rising power. So obviously, from a practical point of view, it is better to attach yourself to the rising power than the declining power. I mean, that's it's not because of any love of China. At the end of the day, as European people, Russians are still obviously have far more in common with other Europeans or with Americans than they do with the Chinese people. I mean, obviously, if I went to the bar here down the road and there was, say, 20 people at the bar and I said, where would you rather go on holidays? Shanghai or New York? I can guarantee you 19 out of 20 would say New York or Paris for that matter, or London. But the reality is that if you look at it from a purely cold, hard cash point of view, you're far better off, looking to China economically at the moment than the West, because China is going where it is and the West is going where it is, and that's all there is to it. What happened is that previously, because of religion and because of ethnicity and because of history, Russia felt that it was its kind of destiny to become part of the West, but that was kiboshed, as you know. If we start talking about that now, we'll be here until next week sometime. Max will grow an even bigger beard, and
well, we'll do it again. Hopefully, I mean, this was really enlightening for me, and I'm sure for most people listening. Where can we follow your work?
Twitter, 27KHV, as Ben said at the start. I just noticed, by the way, before we finished, Max's strategic placement of the management of savagery. So we should definitely give it a plug.
The paperback is out, and I think the cover looks. And,
it does actually. Yeah, it's definitely
thanks to the campaign to basically cancel my book and cancel all my talks, it sold pretty freaking well, and that necessitated a paperback run. So yeah.
Hey Max, show the cover again.
So the drinks are on Max.
And I conceived this symbol. What I wanted was a the CIA logo, but written in ISIS script. But the graphic designer they hired basically took an American eagle and put kind of an ISIS symbol in its breast. So, pick it up. It's out there. None of the positive reviews on the back by Chris Hedges, Asa Winstanley, or the well-known actor Gabriel Byrne are featured on my Wikipedia page. Instead, it's all, one negative attack review by a Pentagon-funded researcher. So
I met Gabriel Byrne many years ago. He's Irish, as you know. He's a very, very nice guy, actually.
Yeah.
Very nice guy. And very smart.
If we're pointing out everyone who's Irish, I feel kind of obligated to point out that I'm mostly Irish. So I've never been to Ireland.
Really?
No.
Well, Norton's an Irish name, so of course,
yeah.
So Max, you're the odd one out here.
Not necessarily. No, I have orange in my family blood.
Yeah, well, clearly he's got red hair, so he looks very Irish.
You could fit in Dublin, no problem. Actually, you'd be fine.
Well, I did, and I fit in even better in Belfast because, it was the first time I'd been around so many white people I agreed with.
It reminds me years ago, I used to know a Jewish guy from Belfast, and he lived in Dublin. And I asked him, why did he move to Dublin? And he said, because he got fed up with people asking him, was he a Catholic Jew or a Protestant Jew? Basically, so he said, at least in Dublin, they don't do that.
Can you speak Gaelic?
Of course. I had to do it in school for 13 years. Of course.
Well, I'm not going to be like it's become kind of trendy among Americans of Irish descent, like generations before, to try to, especially on the left, to try to like reclaim that Irish heritage and post like IRA and Irish nationalist stuff. I'm not going to pretend to do any of that. I think that's kind of like performative, but I mean, I have no links to Ireland, but it seems like a nice country.
Teddy Kennedy used to have a sign in his door that said "Fága Wallach," which means "get out of my way." I don't know why he did that, but there you go. It was on his door in Washington. So, I know that.
Well, it was a pleasure speaking with the resident Irishman in Russia, Bryan MacDonald, an actual Russia expert. You should definitely check out his tweets at 27KHV. He also writes sometimes, and he edits for RT. Definitely check out his very good analysis. I've learned a lot from him, and especially from his tweets. So I think that was a great, refreshing conversation. Thanks for joining us, Bryan.
Thank you.
Sign off in your native tongue. That would be great. And give a shout out to Moderate Rebels.
Yeah, slán leat agus go nairi an bóthar leat. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on, guys. And yes,
that was him saying, "God damn, it's so late. I can't believe he kept us on so long."
And you can support us at patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. We produce this independently, and thanks for all the support. We're going to have some more conversations like this in the coming weeks, and I think we'll get into more U.S. politics as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bryan. We pledged on Patreon that people who support us at a certain level with their pledges every month, that we're going to name them in the episodes. So we want to thank the following patrons: Ali Abunima, Andre Gauthier, Anthony Sarek, Brendan Jadoin, Carl Hartung, Carolyn Beninsky, Curtis Peterson, Des Magner, Hep Ingham, J.L. Logan, Jacob Gellis, Jody O'Donnell, John Wakely, Kristen Dooley, Leonard Goodman, M.K. Hobson, Maria Cho, Martina Ravlich, Matthew Hull, Peter Ghost, Peter Sterling, R.S., Stephen Bray, and Vivek Madala. Thank you so much for the support. It really means a lot. Anyone else who wants to join, you can go to patreon.com/moderaterebels, and we'll see you next time. We're out.